When I was 11, my world crumbled with a single sentence. It wasn't dramatic or screamed in anger. It was a soft, almost apologetic confession that struck harder than any yell could. My parents told me they were sending me to live with another family. At first, I thought it was a joke. They had always been the kind of parents who joked a little too much, often at my expense. But the looks on their faces that evening, over a dinner that tasted like ashes, said otherwise. They said it was because of money, that things had gotten too tight, and they just couldn't give me the life I deserved. That's how they phrased it, the life you deserve. Up until that moment, I thought we were happy. We weren't rich, but we weren't struggling either. At least, not in a way that ever seemed obvious to me. We had a small house with a squeaky porch swing, a dog named Max, and Friday night movie marathons where we'd huddle under the same oversized blanket. I adored my parents. My dad, with his terrible dad jokes and penchant for overcooking steaks on the grill, and my mom, who always smelled like lavender and carried a quiet strength that made me feel safe.
How could they do this to me?
When they dropped me off at the Thompsons' house, I felt like I had stepped into another universe. Linda and Charles Thompson were kind, I'll give them that. Their house was smaller than ours, with mismatched furniture and a faint smell of dampness that clung to everything. They didn't have much, but they tried to make me feel at home. Linda baked cookies that were always slightly burnt, and Charles told stories about his time in the Navy that seemed to stretch the truth a little too far. They weren't bad people. In fact, they were the opposite. They cared for me in a way that felt genuine, unlike the forced kindness my parents had shown in those final weeks. At first, I clung to the hope that this was temporary. Maybe my parents just needed time to get back on their feet. I imagined them working extra shifts, cutting back on luxuries, all so they could come back for me. I daydreamed about the moment they'd arrive, with apologies and hugs and promises that everything would be better. I told myself this every night as I lay in the tiny room the Thompsons had set up for me, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars they'd stuck on the ceiling. But weeks turned into months, and the calls from my parents became less frequent. My mom's voice grew distant, like she was talking to me from the bottom of a well. My dad stopped making excuses altogether. The promises to visit never materialized, and soon, even their voices faded into silence. The Thompsons tried to fill the void. Linda would sit with me for hours, helping with my homework, while Charles taught me how to ride a bike on their gravel driveway. They were good people, but they weren't my parents. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. It had been almost a year since I last heard from my parents, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. If they were struggling so much, why hadn't they reached out for help? Why hadn't they tried to stay in touch? I borrowed Linda's laptop and created a social media account, something I'd never been allowed to do before. It didn't take long to find them. Their profiles popped up immediately, smiling back at me from a screen that suddenly felt too bright. They didn't look like people struggling with financial hardships. My mom was dressed in designer clothes, standing on a yacht somewhere in the Mediterranean. My dad's profile was filled with pictures of exotic vacations, expensive dinners, and a new sports car that gleamed in every shot. They looked happy.
Carefree.
The kind of happiness that made my stomach churn. They had lied to me. They hadn't sent me away because they couldn't afford to keep me. They had sent me away so they could live a life free of responsibilities. A life that didn't include me. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening until it felt like I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled as I clicked through their photos, each one a stab to the heart. My parents, the people I had trusted more than anyone in the world, had abandoned me. And they were doing just fine without me. The betrayal I felt after discovering my parents' secret lives wasn't something I could simply set aside. It consumed me, filling every waking moment with a sharp edge of anger and a gnawing sense of inadequacy. At first, I let the bitterness guide me, pushing away anyone who tried to reach out. The Thompsons bore the brunt of it, especially Linda, who would sit at the edge of my bed, gently asking if I wanted to talk. I never did. How could I explain the rage bubbling inside me? They had taken me in when I had nowhere else to go, yet I couldn't even muster the strength to thank them. But Linda and Charles were patient in a way my parents had never been. They didn't push. They didn't scold. They just stayed, a quiet, steady presence in my chaotic life. Linda suggested I take up some hobbies, something to channel my emotions. I ignored her at first, retreating to the solitude of my room. But the suffocating silence became unbearable. Reluctantly, I joined a local art class. It wasn't much, just a few kids and an older instructor who smelled faintly of turpentine, but it was a start. The act of creating something, no matter how small, became a release. School became another outlet. I threw myself into my studies, not because I loved learning, but because it gave me something to focus on other than the emptiness inside me. The Thompsons noticed the change and encouraged me, praising even the smallest accomplishments. For the first time in what felt like forever, I started to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe I could build a life for myself, even if it was one my parents had no part in. Then there was Jessica. She wasn't the kind of person I'd ever imagined being friends with. She was loud, unapologetically blunt, and had a knack for finding the humor in the bleakest situations. We met during a group project at school, and, to my surprise, she didn't shy away when she learned about my past. If anything, it made her more determined to stick around. Jessica had her own scars, an absentee father and a mother who worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, but she never let it define her. She became my anchor, dragging me out of my self-imposed isolation and forcing me to confront the world again. One day, after weeks of hesitation, I decided to write to my parents. It wasn't an easy decision. Every word felt like it was being ripped from my chest, but I needed them to know how I felt. I poured everything into that letter. The pain, the anger, the betrayal. I told them how much it hurt to see them living a life I could never be part of. I asked them why they had lied, why they hadn't fought for me, why I wasn't enough. Sending the letter was terrifying, but a small part of me still hoped for an apology, or at least an explanation. When their reply arrived weeks later, my hands trembled as I opened the envelope. The words inside were cold and detached, devoid of any remorse. They justified their actions, claiming they had done what was necessary for everyone's happiness. There was no acknowledgement of my pain, no attempt to mend the broken pieces of our relationship. They had moved on, and I was nothing more than a distant memory to them. That letter was the final straw. I realized I couldn't keep clinging to people who had no place for me in their lives. It was time to let go. Jessica helped me burn the letter in the Thompsons' backyard, the flames consuming not just the paper but also the last vestiges of hope I had held onto. Watching it turn to ash was both heartbreaking and liberating. For the first time, I felt like I could truly move forward. That night, I made a promise to myself. I would no longer be defined by their abandonment. I had a new family in the Thompsons, a true friend in Jessica, and a life that was mine to shape. The past was a wound that would always leave scars, but it wouldn't control me anymore. Years passed, and life shifted in ways I never imagined. By the time I graduated high school, the wounds from my past had dulled, though they never fully disappeared. I channeled every ounce of my pain into a relentless drive to succeed. It wasn't easy, but I refused to let my parents' betrayal define me. My focus paid off when I earned a prestigious scholarship to a top university, an achievement that felt like the ultimate validation of my efforts. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel proud. The Thompsons celebrated as if I were their own daughter. Linda baked a lopsided cake, and Charles gave an emotional toast that left everyone teary-eyed. They'd been my rock through everything, and their pride in me only made my triumph sweeter. They'd always encouraged me to aim high, and seeing them beam with joy felt like a reward for all their unwavering support. Jessica, too, was there, cheering me on as loudly as ever. She had become more than a friend. She was family. As I prepared for this new chapter, I started strategizing like never before. I opened a savings account, determined to budget wisely and minimize student loans. I took on a part-time job at a local bookstore where the quiet hours among shelves of dusty novels gave me space to dream about my future. Every dollar I earned was a step closer to independence, a life where I could stand on my own without ever needing to rely on anyone else again. University life was overwhelming at first. The campus was massive, the classes demanding, and the sheer number of people felt suffocating. But I adapted, throwing myself into my studies and making connections with professors who saw potential in me. I joined a few clubs, not for the social aspect, but because they aligned with my career goals. Everything I did was purposeful, each move calculated to build the life I envisioned. Then, just as I started to feel like I had left my past behind, it came creeping back in. One evening, as I scrolled through my social media, I noticed a new message request. The name stopped me cold. It was from my mother. The message was brief, a simple hello and a vague mention of wanting to reconnect. I stared at it for what felt like hours, my mind racing with questions.
Why now? What did she want from me?
But deep down, I already knew the answer. Curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked on her profile. The glamorous photos that had once enraged me were gone, replaced by snapshots of a much more modest life. My father's profile told a similar story. They weren't living the high life anymore. Something had clearly changed, and whatever it was had driven them to reach out to the daughter they had so easily discarded. I didn't respond. Ignoring them felt like reclaiming some small piece of the power they had stolen from me all those years ago. But their attempts didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, I received more messages, each one dripping with faux sincerity. They talked about missing me, about wanting to make things right, but the undertone of desperation was impossible to miss. Jessica, ever the voice of reason, reminded me not to let them back in. She knew me well enough to sense my inner turmoil, the part of me that still craved their approval despite everything. They only want what they can take from you, she said, and I knew she was right. But the emotional tug of their words was hard to ignore. It's a strange thing to long for the love of people you know don't deserve it. The final straw came when I received a message from my father, asking for financial help. He framed it as a small favor, something I could easily afford with my scholarship and part-time job. That was the moment everything clicked into place. They didn't want me back because they had changed or grown remorseful. They wanted me because they needed something I could give them. I blocked them both. It wasn't easy, and for days afterward, I felt a hollow ache where hope had once been. But it was necessary. The life I was building didn't have room for their manipulation. The Thompsons and Jessica were my true family, the ones who had stood by me when it mattered most. I didn't need anyone else. Graduation day was supposed to be one of the happiest moments of my life. The years of sleepless nights, countless sacrifices, and unyielding determination had finally paid off. The campus was alive with celebration, the air filled with cheers and laughter as proud families embraced their graduates. The Thompsons, who had become my true family, were no exception. Linda had tears streaming down her face, and Charles's booming voice was the loudest among the crowd when my name was called. Jessica stood beside them, grinning like a proud sibling. Even Ethan, my boyfriend of 2 years, had flown in to share the moment with me. The joy in their eyes made every struggle feel worthwhile. Linda clutched a bouquet of sunflowers, my favorite, as if presenting me with a trophy. Charles slapped my back with enough force to nearly knock me over, joking that he always knew I'd outshine them all. For a moment, everything felt perfect, as though the ghosts of my past had finally been exorcised. But ghosts have a way of reappearing when you least expect them. As we gathered for photos near the university fountain, I noticed 2 familiar figures lingering at the edge of the crowd. My stomach dropped. It was my parents. They were dressed as if they belonged, my mother in an elegant dress and my father in a sharp suit, their smiles unnervingly confident. They hadn't been invited. I hadn't spoken to them since the day I blocked them on social media. Yet here they were, strolling toward me as if no time had passed. Linda's expression darkened the moment she saw them. Charles instinctively moved closer to me, his protective stance unmistakable. Jessica's grip on my arm tightened, and Ethan, sensing the tension, placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. My parents ignored them all, focusing solely on me. They opened with congratulations, their voices dripping with feigned warmth. My mother mentioned how proud they were, how they had always known I'd do great things. My father chimed in with comments about the struggles they'd endured, painting themselves as victims of circumstances beyond their control. It was a performance, carefully crafted to tug at my heartstrings. But I wasn't the naive girl they had abandoned anymore. I let them speak, their words washing over me like background noise. When they finally paused, waiting for a reaction, I took a deep breath. Calmly, I told them I appreciated their effort to come, but that they had no place here. My voice didn't waver, though my hands trembled slightly behind my back. I told them that forgiveness wasn't something they could demand or manipulate out of me, and that their sudden reappearance only confirmed what I had always suspected. They didn't want me, just what they thought they could gain from me. Their smiles faltered, replaced by indignant outrage. My mother's voice rose, accusing me of being ungrateful. My father claimed they deserved a second chance, that family ties were unbreakable. They weren't pleading anymore, they were demanding. It was then that they revealed their true intentions. They needed financial support, claiming their situation had worsened and that, as their only child, I had a responsibility to help. I felt the anger simmering beneath my calm exterior, but refused to let it control me. Instead, I reiterated my boundaries, making it clear that they had forfeited any claim to my life the day they sent me away. When they threatened to take legal action, suggesting they could sue for financial support under some obscure parental care law, I didn't flinch. Instead, I told them I'd already consulted a lawyer when they first reached out and that their claims had no merit. The surprise on their faces was almost satisfying. Linda and Charles stepped forward then, their support unmistakable. Charles's voice was steady, but firm as he told my parents they needed to leave. Linda's quiet strength radiated as she placed a comforting hand on my back. Jessica's glare could have pierced steel, and Ethan's reassuring presence reminded me I wasn't alone. My parents had no choice but to retreat, their departure marked by angry mutters and self-righteous indignation. As they disappeared into the crowd, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The confrontation had been inevitable, but it also felt like closure. They had tried to invade my life one last time, but this time I had the strength to stand my ground. The people who truly mattered were still by my side, and that was all I needed. Life has a strange way of rewarding resilience. After graduation, I poured myself into a project that started as a casual idea shared with Jessica during one of our late-night brainstorming sessions. We wanted to create an online platform that provided accessible, affordable resources for young entrepreneurs, a way to empower others to break free from difficult circumstances like ours. What began as a modest effort quickly gained traction. Within a year, our platform had thousands of users, and by the second year, we were drawing the attention of investors. Our success felt surreal. Jessica and I worked tirelessly, balancing innovation with practicality, building a community of users who believed in our vision. When the first major investment came through, it felt like validation for all the struggles we had endured. By the time our earnings climbed into six figures, we knew we were onto something truly transformative. The Thompsons celebrated our milestones as if they were their own, their pride in me shining brighter than ever. Ethan, ever supportive, became a quiet pillar of strength as I navigated this whirlwind of growth. But with success came complications. My parents, who I had thought were out of my life for good, found their way back in, this time with more audacious tactics. It started subtly, with vague comments on old social media posts, but quickly escalated into outright manipulations. They made public posts claiming credit for my achievements, painting a narrative where they were the loving, supportive parents who had shaped my journey. The lies were infuriating, but I tried to ignore them, focusing on the work that mattered. Ignoring them only emboldened their efforts. They began contacting journalists, offering exclusive interviews where they spun tales of how they had sacrificed everything to give me a better life. Some of these stories gained traction, creating a temporary shadow over my growing success. The Thompsons were furious, Jessica livid, but I stayed calm. I had faced their manipulation before and knew this was their last desperate attempt to claw their way back into relevance. Jessica and I decided to fight back, not with anger, but with truth. We collaborated with a journalist who had a reputation for exposing the truth, laying bare the reality of my parents' abandonment and toxic behavior. The article that followed was brutal in its honesty. It detailed the years I had spent piecing my life back together, the lies they had told to justify their actions, and the stark contrast between the family I had found in the Thompsons and the one I had left behind. The article went viral. The public reaction was swift and unforgiving. My parents' attempts to manipulate the narrative crumbled under the weight of their exposed lies. Their reputations were in tatters, and any sympathy they might have garnered was replaced with widespread condemnation. It was a strange mix of relief and sadness. While I had won the battle, it was still painful to see just how far they had fallen in their desperation. With the past firmly behind me, I made a decision that felt both symbolic and empowering. I legally changed my last name to Thompson, honoring the family that had been there for me through everything. It was a public declaration of the life I had built, separate from the chaos of my upbringing. The process was emotional, but when the paperwork was finalized, I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. Jessica and I continued to grow our business, turning it into a multi-million-dollar enterprise that helped countless others find their footing. The Thompsons remained my biggest supporters, cheering me on from the sidelines. Ethan and I began planning a future together, one built on trust, love, and mutual respect. For the first time, I felt like every piece of my life was exactly where it was meant to be. Changing my name was more than just a legal procedure. It was a declaration of who I had become. Hannah Thompson, a name that symbolized resilience, growth, and the power of choosing your own family. My past no longer defined me. It was a part of my story, but not the ending. I had written my own legacy, and it was just the beginning.